All right, everybody, welcome back. Thank you for watching this video. This is going to be fun. And again, check out my website here. My name's Dan Hendricks. So this video we're going to talk about a concept that I've been thinking about a lot, which is karmic excavation. And the title of this video is Karmic Excavation, the Delightful Dusthanas and Spiritualizing Nature of Saturn. I think what's important is that the Dusthanas, as well as Saturn, gets a very bad reputation in astrology. And what I really wanted to do was to talk about why that is, but also how all those things which are viewed as so negative, Saturn, the 6th house, the 8th house, the 12th house, the 6th lord, the 8th lord, the 12th lord, and Saturn himself is the Karaka for the 6th house, he's a Karaka for the 8th house, and he's a Karaka for the 12th house. So what's important about these things is we look at these things as such negatives. The dasha of the 8th lord, like this is something Brihaparashara Horashastra tells us, is the dasha of the 8th lord is never going to be a wonderful, splendid time period. And I think that's very true, but that's true to the nature of the individual, especially at the level of the ego. Because when it comes to astrology, what we're always looking at in astrology is we're always looking at the lagna, the particular degree of the lagna, because that's the rising sign. And the reason why that lagna is so important in astrology is because what it shows is it gives us a reference point to how we can judge what the other houses are, where the other planets are placed from that, and will give us some idea of the events and what the other planets rule in relationship to the placement of that lagna relative to the position of the lagna. And then the reason why I'm using that word relative and relationship is because the nature of existence, of how we view our own lives, is how things are happening, the areas of life and the things and the patterns and themes that are happening in our life. We're looking at how it's relative to our position as an individual. And so much of this life, the nature of what we have in this world is we typically, just in a very general statement, is we want everything to stay the same. That's kind of the nature of the moon, is to just adapt. And the moon being so important in astrology, and in its relationship to the aspect of who we are, is the moon always wants to adapt to the situation at hand and to really just kind of make the most of things, right? And we very much the lunar energy is so important to us. It's why it's so prominent in Vedic astrology. Because the moon really represents our individualized consciousness and what it is and how we view the world. That's why the moon is about our emotions, because our emotions are our feelings about the relative things in our life, the good things and the bad things. And so we typically live our lives in this perspective of how things are affecting me, how it's affecting me and how it's affecting my ego and how I deal with it. Because we want things to go smoothly. But the thing is, that's not the nature of life. The nature of life is to grow and evolve. That's why we have all these multiple incarnations, is for growth and to become something better, basically, and to really, and then ultimately, is to experience spiritual realization. And so, but what's interesting is there's kind of this. So I say that, that we're here to evolve, we're here to learn, we're here to grow. And that's an intellectual concept, but very much a part of reality is that we don't want to break out of where we're at. We want to be happy in our comfort zone. We want to have everything that it is that we feel that would make us more fulfilled. We just want to have that stuff, and we just want to feel happy about where we're at. And that's not an intellectual thing. That's kind of an emotional thing. And honestly, that's an ego thing. wanting everything to be good. The ego always wants to be right. The ego is always just looking to adapt to something new, always looking to adapt to a new situation. And that's also why the moon in astrology is said to have no natural enemies of its own, because the moon just views things as, okay, I'm getting this aspect of Saturn and Mars and these cruel planets, so I'm more adapted to cruel situations in my life of things requiring more work. That's no problem. I'm used to that. And so I'm going to make the best with that. And I'm going to want to constantly take that with me wherever I go. But see, that's a very ego thing. But the fact is, so let's go back to what I said, that intellectual concept of growing and evolving. Well, the thing about growing and evolving is it requires three things, three important things, three important factors. It requires work, it requires transformation, and it requires surrendering and letting go of old concepts, ideas, and beliefs and things behind. And so when we're talking about putting in the work, and work is something that's constant, you're always having to go at it. If we want to grow in this world, we want to become something greater, it's not something that we're just going to do because it's like, I'm just going to become this because it's easy. It's about what we do every single day, day in, day out, putting in time. And that's really what the nature of spiritual practice is. Spiritual practice is something that is, where we have to constantly put our time in, we have to put our work in, we have to do our regular sadhana. That's all sixth house stuff. So here's that Dusthana, that sixth house. We're like, oh no, here comes sixth house dasha, right? This is a time of delays and obstacles. Well, it can be viewed as that if you're coming from an ego perspective, but what we should be is we should be delighted. We should be excited to go into these sixth house dashas, because it's like, now it's the time where I can put in the work, where I can focus on the things that I need to do and to get done so that I can grow. Because that's the health itself is related to the sixth house, because health is about what we do on a mundane level every day that makes us better, that helps us improve. Because the other thing about the sixth house, aside from being a Dusthana house, the sixth house is an Upachaya house, a house of growth, a house of increase. And it's increase because we take the time to get in there and do the work. And that's how our health increases. Our health doesn't increase by taking a miracle pill. Our health doesn't increase by talking to a world famous doctor or Ayurvedic physician. Our health increases because we take the time and the effort, we do the work, and we do it on a regular, monotonous, boring, mundane level where we constantly cook our own meals, we eat, take the time out of our day to prepare healthy food choices for ourselves, take the time out of our day to exercise, take our time out of the day basically to put in work on ourselves to make ourselves grow, to make ourselves better. And that's why health is related to that. And that's why, and then in a spiritual sense, what the sixth house represents is taking the time to do your spiritual practices. And so that's where the sixth house, I mean, if you look at it as like from an ego's place of just wanting to stay in one spot and to continue where I am at, that I've found comfort with. The sixth house is a difficult thing when looking at it from that perspective, because the sixth house represents, okay, now I really have to do the work. There's no longer about, just being back here and enjoying and letting things come and flow freely into my life and staying where I'm at. Well, sixth house might represent staying where you're at, but it represents, okay, now there's going to be more effort here. And it's very important. It's a very wonderful house. If you can align your mind and your perspective of like, okay, this is the time where I just get to get in there and I get to work here. Like, this is an important time. And if you can get excited, invigorated, and energized by that idea, then sixth house dashas aren't that bad. And if you can sit there and use that sixth house energy of just like, okay, now is the time where I can put on work to increase things. I can get into that mentality instead of being like coming from the ego perspective of like, oh, I just want to spend time playing Xbox and watching television. Now it's the time of, it's like, wow, I actually get to get involved with things. And so, and I actually get to take the time to put in the work to grow. Now it's the time where I can really focus on putting in the time. And so that's where sixth house is great. And then the delightful aspect of the eighth house. The eighth house really is what the sixth house is working towards. The sixth house is putting in that effort to become something greater. The eighth house is known as the most painful house. And it's the most painful house. Again, where is that pain coming from? It's coming from the ego, because the eighth house represents sudden breaks and changes. Sometimes the eighth house can be indicative of accidents, of falls, basically. And the reason why, but what happens from those falls, if we take the time to actually look at where I was before the eighth house event occurred and where I go to after the eighth house occurred, it's to transform us. It's to make us something greater and better if we use the energy. The eighth house is also the house of devotion. It's a moksha house. It's a deeply spiritual house. It's a house of deep inner meaning and belief. And so when we go through an eighth house dasha, sure, this can be a time of crisis, but it's crisis to the ego, which doesn't want to change, because the eighth house dasha, if you were going into an eighth house dasha, there is going to be a change that happens in your life. There's going to be something that happens, and and it's probably going to be a painful event, because it's probably going to be a break from something. But what's important is that break from something is you have to realize this life, that there's a greater, bigger picture of life. There's a greater perspective of where we're going with things. And that break that's happening is for a bigger purpose. That break that's happening that the eighth house represents something that needs to go. Something that needs to change. Like that had to be let go of, and it's the separating aspect of taking us away from something. But ultimately, it's what we do with this energy. If we sit here from the ego and just go, oh, that's getting taken away from me, oh no, poor me, then it's going to be a terrible time. But if you look at it as like, okay, now what's left? Now where can I go with this energy? I guarantee you with the eighth house dasha, if you come from that perspective at this time, then that guarantees that you're going to be able to find something greater. You're going to find out that there's other things that are no longer slowing you down. And so that's kind of the nature of the eighth house. And then when we look at the 12th house, the 12th house is about expenses, right? The 12th house is about loss, of isolation, of imprisonment, of seclusion, of being taken away. So the 12th house is about this. The 12th house is a very highly spiritual house, because the 12th house is the highest of all the moksha houses. The 12th house also is related to understanding. The 12th house is related to surrender. And so the reason why the 12th house isolates us, the reason why the 12th house gives us all these losses, gives us all these expenses, is because the 12th house is really trying to pull us away from and get us to just to finally let go of that issue. It's like, if you're going to go in that direction, if you're going to sit here with the ego, when you have a lot of 12th house stuff going on, that stuff, everything's going to be going away from you. Everything, because you're supposed to be moving on to a new level. You're supposed to surrender to the fact that, okay, let this stuff go away. Let it go away. I'll be in seclusion from all of these things and this path of my life that just is causing me more energy and work and everything every time I get involved in it. And so the spiritualizing aspect of the 12th house is to get you to surrender, because there's nothing that you can do when we're talking about the 12th house. There's absolutely nothing to be done except to, because the 12th house is the final stage. There's not a 13th house. It goes back to the first house. It's about completion and resolution of the cycle. And so if you stay in an ego perspective during a 12th house dasha of like, gosh, I want these things to stay the same. If you're trying to maintain that status quo, it's going to constantly be something that's going to detract away from you. Whereas what needs to happen in the 12th house is the time where it's like, okay, I just need to let this happen. I just need to let things happen the way that they are. And now, And then Saturn is related to all three of these. Saturn is the Karaka of the 6th house, the Karaka of the 8th house, and the Karaka of the 12th house. And now the nature of Saturn as a planet is Saturn is of all the castes. So there's a Kshatriya caste, which is, Kshatriya is basically like the upholders of Dharma, you know, about really doing our dharmic duties that we really need to do and being it is who we are. The Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata and the stories of Krishna teach us that. And then when it comes to the to Saturn, his caste is the Shudra caste, the caste of it's commonly known as the working class. And I think a lot of astrologers and such pass off this idea of Saturn as a Sudra planet as meaning that if Saturn is like your Atmakaraka or your Lagna Lord, or he rules the 10th house, then that's going to give the person more of a just a work ethic of just being an employee, basically. Where sure, that is absolutely 100% true, but in a spiritual context of it, why Saturn is such a wonderful spiritualizing planet, because what Saturn is, if we take Saturn's energy, you know, what do we know of Saturn? We know that Saturn represents our ability to endure through life, to make it through hardships, because Saturn, you know, if you have Saturn strong in a chart, placed on an angle and great dignity, then you're going to have a lot more hardships in your life to deal with. That's kind of the nature of Saturn, but Saturn is bringing these hardships that we have to deal with. It's like this, Saturn's a very fated planet where he's bringing along the things that we have to karmically work with. And Saturn's a Shudra because it's like ultimately what we are. If you take all these spiritual teachings that talk about the divine Leela, which is like God's play, that we're just here to play a role, you know, it's not about identifying with it like with the moon, right? And it's not about the sun as trying to be the king, however you want to look at that. It's about our role in life is to be Saturn. Saturn is a very spiritualizing planet because Saturn wants us to just accept the fact of who we are, that we are just this flawed being, that we are not, that our body, our egoic attachment, which is just a natural process of manifestation, is to attach yourself to what the consciousness, like the physical form is attached to the consciousness, right? And so with Saturn, what he's ultimately wanting us to do is to just accept that this is our role, that we are flawed and that we just have to go through life and deal with our karmas as they come. So Saturn is very spiritualizing because if we can get into that aspect of just like, okay, this is life, this is reality. Reality is not me wanting to just be wanting this thing and wanting that thing and those things are all going to make me happy. Reality is, you know, I just have to do the work that I need to do through life, because how else are we going to grow and evolve unless we take our path one step at a time? Because Saturn as a Shudra planet and Saturn's natural direction of looking is looking down, of just like, okay, one step at a time here, because Saturn wants us to grow and wants us to transform. And then if you look at the nature of Saturn's Nakshatras, I have a series of videos that I'm actually in the process of making right now. And I might actually release this video after I made those. Not sure, this might come out before I put out that video series. But anyhow, Saturn's Nakshatras, Pusha, the first of Saturn's Nakshatras, is the most auspicious of all the Nakshatras for if you're looking for an event doing Muhurta. And you see the important planet, or especially the moon, is in Pusha. That's a wonderful place. Pusha is like this beautiful place. It's the creation of spiritual energy. And we see that a lot because then Saturn's next nakshatra is Anuradha. Anuradha is about, like, that literal definition means like following or proceeding from Radha. Radha is who but Krishna's devotee, right? Krishna's consort, who is the ultimate devotee of Krishna. And so we're following her, we're following in her footsteps in that idea of, so Saturn gives us, it's a very spiritualizing energy. I mean, when you look at the nature of Saturn's nakshatras, they're just it's this beautiful energy. So I think it's important to understand that Saturn is not all gloom and doom as what is constantly talked about, but Saturn is about becoming something greater by doing the work that we have to do, that we're put here to do, to work through our karmas. And then finally, the last thing I want to talk about in this video is karmic excavation. So basically, when it comes to karmas, we have karmas in our life that we have to deal with that are difficult. That's why there's Dusthanas, that's why there's Saturn. But they're only difficult from the perspective of the ego. But they're difficult because it's representative of the change of things. So if you're looking at a chart of someone and they've got a lot of planets placed in Dusthanas, Dusthana lords with their Dharma lords and Dusthana lords in the first house. This is a person that's going to go through a lot of karmic excavation. And yes, from an ego perspective for this person, it's going to be tough. But what we can tell these people is like, look, you are now in a lifetime of karmic excavation where you're going to be working through some of your difficult karmas. And how you choose to view this lifetime of this little bowl of karma that you're being served is, it's all about how you go forward with this can help your next lifetimes, can help your evolution. Because if you can learn to just surrender to the situation, to put in the work of its sixth house, to get ready for your perspectives to change, to expect the unexpected with the 8th house, and with the 12th house to surrender to the way things are. And if you've got Saturn there, to just know that you're here to do your work and not try to intellectualize everything, nor try to make it about you, about your ego. And so this karmic excavation, this is an intellectual concept to hold and to grasp, and to actually integrate that into our own lives, which is to integrate that into our ego, is very tough. But if we can just keep the perspective that life is, as much as perspective and perception is inherently always in the now, what has to be understood is that we have this tapestry of karma stretching basically infinitely behind us to infinitely ahead of us. And I should say infinitely behind us and indefinitely. I think that's a better word, indefinitely ahead of us. Because indefinitely means that there's not a defining point. It's until we decide to stop identifying with our ego. All the spiritual teachings teach us that. They say stop identifying with the ego and realize that the ego is just a natural sequence for physical manifestation. Is that consciousness has two properties. Consciousness has the property of witnessing, and it also has and identifying. Those are the two things that consciousness is. So consciousness constantly is going to want to identify with its stuff. But if we can stop and just let that process happen and learn to live our lives and accept the things that are just there, which is a very Saturnian perspective, and live in reality, and realize that there's a bigger path ahead of us, and that we just have to take these one steps, and that not every single part of our life is going to be easy and from our egoic perspective, and that any changes and difficulties that come along that path, that's when we have to get involved with. We either have to get involved with the 6th house, expect the unexpected with the 8th house, and surrender to the 12th house. And then that's how we can learn to grow. Because if we can surrender to the new and realize that it's a constant pattern of growth and evolution. Because if you look at a forest, for example, if you look at a forest and you walk in the forest, you're going to see a lot of dead trees. You're going to see a lot of dead plants and dead grasses, but you're also going to see a lot of new growth that comes from that. As those things decay, they create something new. So life is a constant process of growth, death, upheaval, and new growth constantly coming out from that. And if we can see that that's the nature of life, then, and really approach our own lives towards that, we can get through these karmic excavations. and we can grow to become a better person along our path. So anyways, this is my story. This is my intellectual story of the day, something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and hopefully you find value in this. And namaste.